I really appreciate the opportunity to meet many people yesterday and learn about your organizations. And to tell you a little bit about ours, I do represent the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute in Missoula, Montana. And I'm not just a scientist, but I'm a federal scientist. We do maintain the integrity of our science by not working with managers. We acknowledge the managers for these agencies. We recognize the Shield of the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, the Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and then USDS and the science branch of the Interior. But I work for all those agencies. They're our first client, really, in providing knowledge to help them make decisions. We have a lot of collaborators and cooperators around the world. And in Europe, I work strongly with the Wildland Research Institute at the University of Leeds. And Dr. Steve Carver here is my sponsor. He brought me here to this conference, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Steve, and the University of Leeds. We do a lot of work with them on a variety of topics around the world. I do also represent the International Journal of Wilderness. I was disappointed. One of my colleagues yesterday told me she's not read the International Journal of Wilderness, but I'll make sure she gets a whole stack of them very soon. And I encourage you, that's all on the web up to the last 2 years. If you subscribe, you get the most current issues as well. So it's an important journal, and I wish to learn that every Pan-Parks member organization would have access to that, because there's 15 years now accumulated knowledge at the international level that we think is very important and work hard to. I also represent the Executive Committee of the World Wilderness Congress, and we met last in 2009 in Merida, Yucatan Peninsula, Mexico, and many of you know that we're slated for Europe in 2013. We're very aware internationally of what's going on in Europe and anxious to learn more. And we're looking at Salamanca in Spain in 2013. There's a little bit of background noise in this presentation, and it's because of something that Zoltan said to me a while back when we were first starting to plan me coming over. He said, maybe if you have an opportunity, you would mention your motorcycle trip to Merida, Mexico. I think people in Europe wouldn't be interested in the fact that Steve Carver and I decided to go to Merida, Mexico, clear around on the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula by motorcycle. But he convinced me that I should at least mention it. And so instead of pretty slides from wilderness in North America, you're going to see pictures from our motorcycle trip in the background. So if that's confusing, I hope you understand. Just consider it background noise. Ignore the pictures if you'd like. But you will see images like this in the background. So it's background noise. And most people know that we're already looking for people and planning a trip through parts of Europe in 2013 on the next World Wilderness Congress. Somehow there's a wildness element that attracts us to get very intimate with your people, your country, the scenery, and making some stops along the way. So I am going to talk about human connectivity. I am a social scientist, not just a scientist, but a scientist trained in natural resources and human values. And I'm going to set the stage here. There's no motorcycles here. So it's the only slide that doesn't have any aspect of that trip. But it does have our National Wilderness Preservation System in the United States. So that's my background. That's where I'm coming from. And I actually chose an article from the International Journal of Wilderness in an issue on relationships between people and wilderness a few years ago in 2007. And we had a colleague in the Park Service, Rick Potts. We have a colleague here this week, Gary Oy from the Park Service. So this person preceded him in that position. And he published an article, and he represented to me our agency's interest in connectivity between people and wilderness. And I just extracted a few comments that he made to set the stage for us. And he said that managing wilderness ultimately is about engaging people. Often we say it's about managing people. Rick Potts in the Park Service came out a few years ago and said, you know, our problem might not be too many people in the wilderness, it might be too few people in the wilderness. And as a scientist, we started thinking about that. What do we do? What's the solution? What kind of science do we need? Rick in that article said that helping people get into wilderness, they will love it with sufficient depth to stand and fight for it, even if it means personal sacrifice. Matthew, it sounds kind of like a conversation we were having about 11 o'clock in the bar last night, doesn't it? we went these places last night and talking about, in Europe, about relationships with nature. So I'm sure many of you relate to what Rick was saying. And he said our passion, and just like the people sitting around the bar at 11 o'clock last night, we kind of all felt like our passion was fueled by our experiences of backpacking, river running or canoeing, mountain climbing, skiing, packing in on mules and horses. That's kind of Rick Potts. He's really into horses and mules. And I think it was Leopold that said wilderness, travel by pack, train, and canoes, American is the hickory tree. I got changed on that a little bit yesterday on our canoe trip here in the park. So I was glad to see that the travel by canoe not being just an American wilderness thing. So we should acknowledge other people travel by canoe. But where Rick ended up with, and the Park Service asked us to help with science, was at the end today, the majority of younger generations would trade the bedrolls for BlackBerries, iPods, and video games. We'll go right back to our conversation at 11 o'clock last night. Even ourselves trying to figure out how to push those things back and thinking about the role. And we're doing a lot of research right now on technology and wilderness visits and visitation. So I want to offer you a roadmap. And I'm going to go fairly quickly. I know I just have like 20 more minutes to move fairly quickly through a presentation. And this presentation is really the precursor, the introduction to a workshop tomorrow. So I'm going to introduce to you a dilemma that I think we're facing in the United States and how we're working through it. And it's a dilemma that I hope that people from Europe are interested in setting down. I'm anxious to hear some discussion of this dilemma tomorrow in the workshop. So I want to talk a little bit about wilderness and human well-being. I want to talk about values formation, kind of how young people form values, what we're thinking about, what we're learning about. I want to look at some of the trends. In the United States, we've had a science component to wilderness management for a long time. Our Wilderness Act passed in 1964. We already had people doing wilderness research before that act went into place. It was in 1967 the government formally established what has transitioned now in the institute that I belong to. We're the only institute that focuses on wilderness research, but we're very fortunate. It's been a very short history. There's David Cole and me, and we were trained and hired by Bob Lucas and George Stanke, and we brought other people in. But I'm the second generation wilderness scientist right now in the United States, and I assume before long we'll move to the third generation. But some of us have been there for a long time, built our lives around science, and so we've studied trends in relationships between humans and wilderness that I want to share a little bit with you. And then introduce a dilemma, somewhat of a debate. I think we have a lot of common ground, and I hope to discuss it in that workshop tomorrow. I handed out that brochure because when I looked at it just a month ago, again, it's been around for a while, the very first sentence in that brochure that Steve just passed around for me, it shows that different perspective again. If you read that first line, it says, wilderness areas contribute significantly to our nation's health and well-being. We're different people in this room. If you're a manager, you probably go, oh yeah, that's why I'm in this field. If you're an activist, you're probably going, oh yeah, that's right. I need to go out and tell people that, you know. As a scientist, Steve and I would look back and go, okay, where's your reference? Where's your citation? You know, do a Google wilderness and human well-being and see what comes up. Well, unfortunately, hardly anything, if anything, comes up. And so I'm going to offer you another short roadmap, and this comes from an article that was just accepted for publication in the Social Indicators Research Journals. Okay, that I decided to take this topic on and try to understand the link between wilderness and human well-being. And what's important, probably, most of us in this room probably don't question that statement. But are we using the right terminology is the question. And this journal helps us sort through that. So in that journal and in the literature on quality of life, there's many indicators of quality of life all over the world. I'm sure you're familiar with it. In Bhutan, that has a happiness index that they're quite excited about. Norway, does some research on that topic as well. Quite often, they're complex indices. They're looking at different things and trying to figure out what quality of life means in different cultures. And I think I've seen as many as 25 to 30 of those summarized in that one journal and arguing which one's the best. And some folks have taken the opportunity to try to bring those down into theoretical foundations. Okay, and I'm not going to go into these theoretical foundations. I've got the paper. All of our literature is available at wilderness.net. It's very simple. I'm glad we got it before Europe got it. Wilderness.net. You can put Point Leopold and look at all of our publications if you're interested in science. But there is several foundational kind of approaches to quality of life. And what I was looking for was, where does wilderness fit in? It's not showing up in the literature reviews. We say it's a part of well-being and quality of life, but is it? And those break down into 6 major theoretical foundations. And we're talking about that last night at the bar too, somehow. And I didn't lead that conversation, but we got into economic development and gross national products and development indices of quality of life. And those have involved in socioeconomic development. Personal utility is probably the thing that scared all of Leopold the most, and scared many of us in the wilderness, that will be the basis for all decisions. Social justice, kind of theoretical foundations, are quite promising, talking about access for across society and benefiting society now and in the future. Human development, sustainability is a newer one that's popped up and had a whole theoretical foundation being incorporated to not think just economic, but think more complex. And functioning capabilities, I won't go into those, but I'll tell you what I kind of pulled out of reviewing those theoretical foundations. That almost all of them today have some aspect of environmental well-being as well as human well-being and quality of life. Okay, so hey, we're pretty safe making that statement. Wilderness isn't in that literature. As I say in the last point, it's never mentioned. It's in none of the quality of life literature. Time in wilderness is not a centerpiece, even though to us philosophically, talking with our children and our friends and sponsors, it probably is. We think that's the key to everything. It's not in that literature. But even the models, more progressive, liberal models of the socioeconomic approaches nowadays have evolved into broad inclusion of natural, social, and built capital. Natural capital, social capital. Acknowledge the role of intact ecosystems. Collective action to provide equitable and fair access to resources, and both public and private infrastructure which protect the relationship between humans and nature. Wow, that's what we're doing here. That's what we do a lot. A lot of you, that's your profession, I'm sure. We don't use those terms very much when we start talking. And right now, we're highly motivated to get this wilderness concept, using this terminology, into that quality of life literature. We'd love for our legislature, we'd love for our foundations, we'd love for our managers to all start talking a lot more about quality of life and how wilderness fits into that. Okay? So I'm going to leave that quality of life behind to let you know that we're looking at it, we pull some terminology, and I'm going to move to young people. Remember, Rick Potts was concerned about losing their bedrolls, and they're different than us in terms of the Blackberries and iPods and et cetera. And there's another field of literature that we're trying to bring into this quality of life and wilderness discussion. And it's very North American centric right now. But I highly suspicion that it's going to evolve very quickly in Europe and other parts of the world. And it's talking about people between the age of 18 and 25. And I threw a picture of a Salish woman that Steve Carver and I work with in the U.S. She's an American Indian woman who looks to elders for vision, the visionaries. But actually, many of us are looking at young people now as the visionaries. Those are the people I'm learning from and trying to understand, as Rick Potts suggested, how do we engage them? Not just manage them, but how do we engage them in the wilderness debate or discussion? And this literature is suggesting that people 18 to 25, and I will say it's North American-centric research, are seeking out and evaluating alternative worldviews. This area of literature is only about maybe 6 or 7 years old, and it's in psychology, and where kind of adolescents used to meet young adulthood, they're separating it now into this emerging adulthood. And we're strongly convinced, more than when people are children or more than when they're 50 years old, this is when their lifetime, long-term values are forming. These are the people and the age of the people that are developing these attitudes towards love, marriage, and work, and nature, and politics. And now we're back with Rick Potts going back to saying, what we did, when we were exposed to wilderness. And now you're all back at 18 to 25-year-old time in your own life, probably, and thinking about how your values form. but it's many persistent values of form, identity exploration, and actually these were a very heavy user group of wilderness in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, back when many of us started, my peer group started using wilderness. I'm not going to say a lot about that, but we're going to come back and let you know that we've got an extremely good set of literature that's driving us toward the focus on those people and understanding how they're forming their values and where wilderness and quality of life might play. So I'm going to turn a little bit to, is Joe in the room, I hope, this morning? We had a little discussion yesterday about Sigurd Olson. How many of you have read Sigurd Olson? Have you ever read anything by Sigurd Olson? Not very many. I pulled out the 8 or 9 books that he published back in the 50s and 60s a year ago and kind of put a paper together to try to understand what was happening at the time we passed our Wilderness Act. And it's so interesting because in Europe and now Asia is interested. We're doing some wilderness things in Asia. You're at a completely different place than we were in the 1950s and 60s when we were coming into the wilderness debate in the United States. But Sigurd Olson was the president of the Wilderness Society when we established our wilderness. He was the follower of people like, Leopold, Bob Marshall, Olaus Murie. He was kind of in line to inherit kind of their work and come in as the spokesperson for wilderness in the United States. And the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is a place that we've been looking at for a long time in terms of trends. And he described that as the rugged wilderness of rivers and lakes known as the Queco Superior Country. We've been studying that place for a long time, and I'm going to give you just one piece of information from several years of research and multiple studies that I want to focus on for just a minute, and that is the fact that the average age of the visitors to that wilderness, and it's our heaviest used wilderness, Forest Service wilderness in the United States. The average age in 1969 was 26, in 1991 was 36, and in 2007 it was 45. The age of those people have changed. People go by my desk, if they see that table or something, they'll kind of glance over their shoulder and go, look like the same people to me. You're right, it is. See, scientists get to focus on means and standard deviations and tests, and somebody else can just glance at it and go, looks like the same people to me. Uh-oh, Rick Potts is kind of concerned about that. Where are we headed with wilderness United States? So again, looking back at Olson in 1969, and he's a wonderful philosopher. He was an advocate for canoe country. He was an advocate for wilderness. But from his book in 1969, Open Horizons, he's asking, did we have the right to deprive future generations of what we have known? What would the future bring? And he certainly establishes us in that commitment to that objective of making sure future generations have what we had. And that's part of our dilemma. I'll go through these pretty quickly, we've got a few minutes, but we know, looking at in our system at how people live in the boundary waters, not just that age, there are much less students. This is where people look over my shoulder and go, it's the same people, it's the same people, it's the same people. And even the gender hasn't changed over time, that place. They're much less likely to be first-time visitors. They're much more likely to have experience in other wilderness. There's a good 40-year perspective of our wilderness users at one place that we've studied heavily in the United States. It's driving us right now to think about the world of wilderness. What alarms us is that they're 97% white, Caucasian people in a very mixed society. 45% are from medium to large cities. That's increased drastically over time if you look at that change. And again, it's the same people, and they're reporting more crowding than they have in the past. I want to introduce this dilemma because this is the workshop we're going to look at tomorrow. We can look at Sigurd Olson, who's heavily influenced us to think of the Song of the North. Still filled in the same gladness as when I heard it first, when he was an emerging adult. Aha! So he started going to the wilderness when he was very young. He was a college student, introduced to the North Woods. They developed his values for his whole lifetime. Came not only from the land of the Great Lakes, but vast regions beyond. It had promise and meaning and sang of the freedom and challenge of the wilderness. Oh, if we could all talk like that, we'd have everybody convinced that wilderness is wonderful, and they would all rush out there and spend their time and develop the values we want them to, it seems like. He says, he became part of the North, and the melody I heard was loud and clear. Oh, wonderful stuff that he was talking about. So we're faced with challenges. And we're trying to make these kinds of decisions, and we're watching what other people might do as well. I'd be curious if you come to our workshop tomorrow, you might be in a group that focuses and helps us answer this maybe for Europe. If we want to find a way to attract a larger part of society, do we? Or are you comfortable with the people who are, in this room, or the people you work with? Is it a homogeneous society? Is it people like you? Is it an aging society? Who is interested in wilderness? We're asking that question in our country. Do we want them to gain the benefits of traveling and sleeping that we try to protect and pass through the Wilderness Act, and Sigurd Olson talked about a lot? But maybe we should focus on emerging adults. This literature is quite convincing that this is value formation. And maybe it's not extremely young children. It's not 40-year-old people, even 30-year-old people. It's college-age people in our society. And that varies in other societies. But people who are searching out these alternative worldviews, that's who. We've even developed proposals to focus on emerging adults, emerging urban adults. Or let's focus on universities in metropolitan areas of the Intermountain West. That's where we should be if we want to develop, influence the values of people that's in line with our cultural history in our country. Because we're losing those people, we're losing those relationships. What about females? Do we want to target females or emerging urban females? I mean, what is our clientele? We're not convinced it's just, let's just develop education, let's just develop brochures, get them out there, and that's going to convince people that wilderness is important. We think there's some market segmentation appropriate and crucial. What about underrepresented ethnic groups? Are we comfortable with 97% white in our society? What's that mean long-term for wilderness? If we're basing our evaluation on use and visitation, that may lead to some problems. We don't have many inexperienced users. Most people are repeat visitors at Boundary Waters. They're not first-time users at Boundary Waters or other places. Can we identify those people and really begin marketing or thinking about trying to, as Rick Potts would say, engage first-time users, engage the inexperienced? That's what we should be all about. And alternatively, so many of our users are kind of wealthy leisure. They're retired, they're urban, they're highly politically influential. Maybe that's okay. Some people would argue that's okay. It's not so bad that we're serving that clientele. But right now, our research resource, even though we acknowledge that possibility of number one, that's not what we're investing in at the Leopold Institute right now for our federal agencies. We're beginning to realize that rather than insist all of society visit the wilderness to receive that set of benefits that was so desired by many in the 1960s, our responsibility may be to promote awareness and commitment to protection areas with wilderness characteristics for other than use values. And here we're operating at the highest level of our federal management agencies. Okay? The director of the Park Service, the chief of the Forest Service, the director of BLM, the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service are quite excited about the idea of ecosystem services. And I just wrote an article called "What Would Aldo Do?" and suggested as a scientist in the United States, I'm looking over my shoulder at Aldo Leopold, who kind of promoted the wilderness ethic, the land ethic in the United States, and we're an outgrowth of his influence. But we're trying to acknowledge that human well-being may flow today more from environmental well-being. That maybe that engagement, all those indices of human well-being, when it got to kind of engagement in recreation or engagement in nature, that's an element in there. And we're starting to think that maybe just the weighting in our society, it's not 1964 anymore. I drafted an article with that title too. Not 1964 anymore. We're at a very different place than we started our wilderness system. Look how the users have changed. Their perceptions, their kind of who they are, their description. And maybe, we do know that young people have very strong environmental values in the U.S., but they're not expressing them as Sigurd Olson would have liked us to express them. They're probably expressing them in other ways that we haven't really capitalized on. Biodiversity, carbon storage reservoirs, and sources of high-quality water for off-site benefits, young people are supporting those kind of environmental values. Those are core values of our wilderness. And I know you're talking about developing an ecosystem services research agenda here in Europe. That's where we are. We're working hard with our federal agencies. And it's not the visitor management people in the Park Service or the Forest Service. We're working with market incentives people. We're working with people very engaged in trying to understand these off-site influences. And it's a North American collaboration, an outgrowth of the last World Wilderness Congress. We signed an agreement between Canada, U.S., and Mexico to work together, understand, and kind of present to people these ecosystem service values. We're trying to, I'm a scientist, I'm trying to develop a brochure like how to communicate to the public and managers, because our managers aren't with us yet to understand ecosystem services. They're still focused on engaging people. We need more people, not less people in the wilderness. We really need to think that through. So the assured protection of wilderness attributes through showing commitment to ecosystem services may be the way that we achieve engagement and political support. The last slide is simply to remind you, Hill and I often go back, and how many times a year do you go back and read some of Aldo Leopold? You know, quite often. So do we. Like I said, my most recent article was What Would Aldo Do? You know, implying that we're always looking over our shoulder. That was a person who inspired us as students when I was 18 to 25, and he still inspires us. But he said the richest values of wilderness lie not in the days of Daniel Boone. How many people know who Daniel Boone is? American is a hickory tree. But think of, you know, the pioneer, the explorer, you know, the male image of exploration and going into wilderness that was influencing people like Sigurd Olson and others. That's what they're writing about. But Leopold, even back in his day, said the richest values of wilderness lie not in the days of Daniel Boone, nor even in the present, but rather in the future. And we've got this dilemma that they're not necessarily exclusive. We'll probably work forward with both of them. But tomorrow what we have is a workshop. I say bring your tools, and hopefully we'd like to get down to nitty gritty and get dirty like my Harley did in Mexico, and really think about what kinds of orientation, how we move forward in ecosystem services in Europe, and how you move forward in engaging people in wilderness in Europe and actually through on-site experience. Okay? Thank you.